Hey guys, I'm Ted. Welcome back to our lecture series. And for this lecture, we are going to embark on a 7-part, very large look at the home front of the wars, at the home front of the Confederate States, the United States, and how the different groups within those two nations sort of dealt, sort of how they sort of experienced the war. We're going to look at the behind the scenes actions and take a step back from the battlefield. But before we begin our examination at the home front, I just like to do a customary recap and just touch on where we left off when we ended our lecture on emancipation. So in our lecture on emancipation, we wrapped everything up with the effects of emancipation, what emancipation meant domestically and internationally. We took a look at Lincoln's role, President Lincoln's role in the emancipation process, and more importantly, we examined who led emancipation, from President Lincoln to the Congress to the field commanders, the military officers in the field, and more important, what's becoming very important, the roles and the actions of slaves, who sort of created the situation that brought those other three forces into dealing with the emancipation, myself emancipating themselves by leaving their plantations and creating a crisis, so to speak, that needed to be addressed. All right, and now with that being said, let's dive right into looking at the home fronts. So, diplomacy, off the top, diplomacy had been a key area for both belligerents, both the United States and the Confederate States during the war. Most notably, the role that France had played in the American Revolution, in the Revolution of 1776, stood out to Confederates who were lobbying hard to gain official recognition from both France and the United Kingdom. Now, the slave states' cotton fueled the textile industries of both countries, especially the British. Now, this led the Confederate States to believe that the British would intervene in the war to make certain that there would be no interruptions to the flow of cotton to their mills. The Confederate States hoped that the British would use their navy to break the United States blockade to the end of the federal blockade. The war, they hoped that war would erupt between the two powers and France would join the British in fighting a war against the United States, and provide aid as well, whether with military or financial. They hoped that with the British and the federal government, the United States going to war, that the French would either join the side of the British militarily, or they would provide loans to the Confederate States and or provide easy access to military equipment to the Confederate States. Now, to drive home to the British and the French just how important their cotton was, the Confederate States actually destroyed the majority of the 1860 crop. The majority of the 1860 crop, which had been a record year crop. It was very ironic that in the years leading up to the Civil War, there have been a number of record years for agriculture in the United States. There were record wheat years and record cotton years. In 1860 had been a record cotton year. Most of that 1860 export crop was destroyed. The Confederate States then enacted an embargo against the United Kingdom and France. They were denying them their cotton. They were trying to drive home just how central cotton was. The embargo was disastrous. The cotton states, the cotton that the Confederate States produced did not have the effect they thought it did on the United Kingdom. Not to be certain, cotton was very important to the United Kingdom's economy. Men were thrown out of work. Mills closed. But when the mills closed, war material industries opened new factories. Iron smelting plants, munition factories, all welcomed the displaced cotton mill workers, textile mill workers. They were all welcome there. They were all given those jobs. The economy functioned. There was an increased need for dock workers to meet the wartime demand. Wool and linen production increased in Great Britain. The British also found new sources of cotton. They developed new sources of cotton in places that they already controlled, like India and Egypt. And most importantly, the British had been eyeing what was going on in the United States for quite some time, and they had been stockpiling stores of cotton so that they would not be caught, slacking, caught asleep at the wheel. So King Cotton diplomacy failed for the Confederate States. Now, the United States, they enacted a blockade. Now, the blockade on the Confederate ports was another source of international contestation. The Confederate States had hoped that the British would be enraged by the blockade and that they would use their very large and powerful Royal Navy, bring all them to bear on the United States Navy and end this blockade. They found that that while the French and the British felt the sting, neither were really compelled to act. And what really infuriated the Confederate States was that the United States never fully closed off the Confederate coast. In many ways, the United States blockade was a simple paper blockade, and the British chose not to challenge it. The British did so for purely nationalistic reasons. The United Kingdom during the 19th century was the premier naval power in the world. They often blockaded other nation ports to drive home points, to influence their particular diplomacy with those nations. They argued that their blockades were always legal and complete, even if they had not sealed off every port. They argued that a blockade was legal and enforced if you made that attempt to seal every port. The blockade was legal. They could not ask the United States Navy to cover every port in the Confederate States because the same demand will be made of them the next time they attempted to blockade a nation. This was a severe blow to the Confederate States. They had really counted on the British Navy challenging the United States Navy. The failure of King Cotton diplomacy and the failure of the British Navy to intervene and to lift the the United States blockade were a severe blow to them diplomatically. They had overestimated their hands in both cases. Now, the British disappointed the Confederates on a number of levels, in a number of instances. Another one with their strict neutrality. The British followed a very strict neutrality. And the only time the British came close to war with the United States, and this had nothing to do, by the way, with trade, the blockade, or even Confederate battlefield success. The only time the British came close to declaring war on the United States was in November of 1861, when the USS San Jacinto stopped the British vessel RMS Trent and seized two Confederate emissaries, James Mason and John Slidell, who were taken to Boston and imprisoned. Now, the British objected to the stopping of a neutral vessel and seizing passengers from said vessel. The British sent troops into Canada and additional ships to Canada. This was enough for the United States to back down. The Secretary of State, William A. Seward, admitted that the United States had acted improperly and illegally in seizing those two passengers from a neutral ship. The emissaries were released, and the crisis abated without further incident. The Trent Affair, the only time the two nations came close to actual warfare. Now, the closest the Confederate States came to being recognized by foreign powers came in 1862. Many were convinced that the Confederate States were winning the war, though they only had success in the Eastern Theater and were in dire straits in the Western Theater. The failures of the Maryland campaign of 1862 caused the two powers to back away. Antietam and the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation dampened enthusiasm for the Confederate States. The Confederate States were an openly slave-holding republic, and the United Kingdom and France were deeply anti-slavery. They would not have backed them after the proclamation. Charles Francis Adams, the son of President John Quincy Adams and grandson of John Adams, he was serving as the ambassador to the court of St. James, the American ambassador to the United Kingdom. He remarked that the Emancipation Proclamation had done more to further the United States cause than all the prior victories and efforts at diplomacy combined. Now, tensions would remain fraught between the United States and the other powers, but open hostilities never developed. They never got to the point to where they were actually fighting each other. Now, the United States prevailed. Unequivocally, they prevailed in the diplomatic sphere because the Confederate States, and mostly because the Confederate States lacked the ability to score enough consecutive victory to convince the European powers to act, but also because of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. They made sure that no foreign observer would intervene in the war. Now, both the United States and the Confederate States had difficulty keeping men in uniform, armed, and supplied. The Confederate States had an amazing initial surge that saw great numbers of volunteers. However, many enlisted for only 1 year, and by 1862, the Confederate States faced the prospect of suffering a complete and total military collapse by having the bulk of their armies, the bulk of their soldiers leave their armies. So in April of 1862, the Confederate Congress passed a Conscription Act, which made all white males between the ages of 18 and 35 eligible for military service for 3 years. It also retained those who had previously entered military service for a year. To many in the Confederate States who had volunteered for a shorter term of service, this seemed like a betrayal. This was a major shift from the previous wartime attitude of a sitting government in United States history. There had never been a draft before this. Or any sort of compulsory service. It had never happened previously in the early republic or even in the colonial era. It was only ever done in this instance. That this is the beginning of the draft in United States history. And it was noted as being deeply ironic that the Confederate States were the first to resort to such measures, but they would not be the only ones. Now, because it was ironic and it was derided because they had trumpeted states' rights and individual freedoms had the secession crisis and early stages of the war unfolded. Now, for their central government to begin forcing men into military service, this was seen as just a betrayal. It was seen as too much. Now, the act was modified later in the year to include men between the ages of 18 and 45. And it will be modified again in February of 1864 to include white males ages 17 to 50 years old. Now, conscription was extremely unpopular, and some men evaded the draft, but most went into service to avoid being drafted. The Confederate States garnered about 20% of its soldiers through conscription. Most simply enlisted to avoid that draft. Now, the United States put about 500,000 immigrants into uniform and roughly 180 to 200,000 African Americans into service. Most of the United States soldiers were volunteered, but the United States also resorted to a military draft. In March of 1863, the United States implemented a military draft. The Enrollment Act of 1863 called for all men ages 20 to 45 to be drafted into the United States Army. Though they did allow men to purchase a substitute. Now the Confederates had a similar program, and in the Confederate system, you would be exempted from military service if you had 20 or more slaves. And of course, in the United States, you could be exempted from military service if you paid commutation fee. Commutation fees got you out of an individual draft. Now, both draft systems allowed you to purchase a substitute. Now, the substitute got you out of future draft callings until the war ended. You paid somebody else to do your military service for you. That was substitution. Commutation, substitution, and 20 or more slave exemption made many men in the North and the South view the Civil War as a rich man's war, but a poor man fight. Many people got the message that it was simply a poor man's fight. And this led, particularly in the United States, to open hostilities. Has noted the Democrats were anti-war, the Democrats were anti-black, and the Democrats were strongest amongst the Irish. This would lead to an outbreak of a major draft. As a matter of fact, just as the draft were beginning to unfold, it led to a major draft in a draft riot in New York City, and it's called a draft riot, but it really was a major race riot. In 1863, that spring of 1863, it occurred. Well, not that spring. This was the summer. This was right after Gettysburg. What happened was right after Gettysburg, the men who had fought at Gettysburg were actually sent racing up north to New York City to put down this riot. During the first draft call, many laborers and recent Irish immigrants began to turn violent at what quickly became an anti-African American riot. The rioters went on a rampage, destroying large sections of the city's African American quarter. The rioters burnt down a black orphanage. They kept the fire brigade away. They fought off the police. The state militia couldn't put them down. They rampaged through the black community, just killing black people. Men were lynched, women were beaten, children were killed. It was one of the ugliest scenes in United States history. And the veterans of Gettysburg, the men who had just fought at Gettysburg, were raced up north to put down the riot. One of the ugliest scenes in United States history. It was evasion. People began to evade the drafts. Men went to more remote mountainous regions in the United States. For the first time, men went to Canada to avoid a draft. The United States and the Confederate States, they began to use enlistment bounties to sort of counter that. Bounties and bonuses became prominent now. They became tools to get men to enlist. And there's a number of instances of men who became bounty jumpers. They would go in, sign up, receive their bounty, and then skip town. There's a number of instances of men who did this on multiple occasions throughout the United States and the Confederate States before being caught and sent off to war. Now, to just sort of wrap things up on the draft. The draft and the substitutes and so forth provided roughly 6% of the manpower for the United States. They really did not have that much of an effect on the war. Most people were willing to go into the fight whenever counties or states called for volunteers. Now, the Civil War had the reputation of being the rich man's fight, rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. But it really wasn't. There was a good mix of elements from both the upper, middle, and lower classes in both the United States and the Confederate State armies. But it still must be noted that a number of prominent men managed to evade service, and in particular, John D. Rockefeller evaded service in the Civil War, and Grover Cleveland, rising Democratic politician, evaded service in the Civil War. Now, both sides, and now with that said, I want to break here. Before I get into production. We'll begin part 2 of our examination of the home front with production and manufacturing on the home front. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you guys think about this lecture, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and comment. As always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time.